Well,
Ya
good
estoy.
day, and
Wow.
welcome to this event from Chicago Studies. I'm so grateful that we are able to launch with this particular presentation a new series focused on the sources of data that can inform research, activism, and other forms of engagement about the city of Chicago. Appropriately enough, we're beginning with one of the ones that I think many of us have probably made use of, which is the City of Chicago's open data portal. And to introduce presenter, I'm going to hand things off in a moment to our faculty director, Dr. Sabina Schenk. Before we begin, I would encourage you, as you're logging in, to make sure that your audio is muted so that we don't pull focus away from the speakers. There will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of today's session. However, if you have a question along the way and you want to drop it in the chat, we'll be taking a look at that as we go, and we'll invite some of those questions to be brought forward when we get to a good moment for those questions. Again, though, there will be plenty of opportunity at the end. So I look forward to a great conversation. And with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Sabina, who is the faculty director for Chicago Studies and the director of the program on the global environment. Sabina.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many people here, so many students from my classes and some friends and colleagues. I'm thrilled for today's session, the first in the Data and Dialogue series by Chicago Studies. Thank you to Chris for organizing all of these, and to his team of graduate and undergraduate students who've helped put this together. I'm thrilled for today's session on the Chicago Data Portal. It's a source I've used often for my teaching, and I have many questions about, some of which I've already asked Tom before we started here. There's a lot to say about the rapidly increasing uses of data and information in city planning and policy. A lot of good and some certainly questionable. So we are fortunate to have with us today an expert in data analytics. So I'd like to introduce Tom Schenk Jr., who's currently the Director of Analytics for KPMG. Previously, he was the Chief Data Officer and before that, the Director of Analytics for the City of Chicago, and was the Chief Architect of the Chicago Data Portal, which was launched in 2012 by Mayor Emanuel.
I can put my headphones
He's
on.
also the head organizer for the Chicago Data Visualization Group, which I lifted from your LinkedIn profile, Tom, so you'll have to tell us more about that, and has been the chair of the Civic Analytics Network in Cambridge. He has a BA and MS in economics, which I thought was interesting, given my field is economics, but I'm not a data scientist at all. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom, if I can just remind everybody to mute, and if you have any questions along the way, please put those into the chat, as that's how we'll take questions for Tom at the end. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Tom. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to join you, pleasure to be chatting with you. It would be great to do this in person, but of course, given our constraints, happy to be connected with you. Christopher, Sabina, thank you for the introduction on this, the organizing of it. This sounds like a great new series to introduce University of Chicago students to introduce all of you to a lot of great initiatives that are happening throughout the city of Chicago and being connected with the community. And I'm happy to talk to you today about the Open Data Portal, because that's one way that will help you understand what's happening within the Chicago community. This can be helpful for understanding what's happening around you, but it can also be helpful for projects, for areas of study, to understand and build applications on top of. So there's a lot of different use cases and a lot of different ways to think about open data. I'm going to share my screen here. Let me get this shared. Let me know. Sabina, if you can let me know when you have this in front of you.
It is good to go.
Awesome. So I want to talk about the Open Data Portal and a variety of different things you can do with it. I'm going to talk and just touch on a number of different aspects on it. We have an hour, not going to spend the entire time talking about going through a presentation, but want to touch on some high points, and then hopefully we can get into a bit of a conversation and Q&A about open data, maybe things that are available, or maybe things that we can that you can do with it. So the City of Chicago Open Data Portal can be accessed at data.cityofchicago.org. That's data.cityofchicago.org. And so there's a lot of different information that is contained within the Open Data Portal. You can bring in information, for instance, potholes or 311 data that's all brought into this, into the data portal. Now we have over 600 different data sets that's sitting there on that website. And these data are quite diverse. As I mentioned, potholes, but it could also include things such as every single Uber and Lyft trip. All of that information is contained within the data portal. That's over 150 million different rows. It contains every single crime that has occurred in the city of Chicago from 2001 until present. That's a little over 6 million rows. But by far, the most popular data set that people use and want to access is actually only 33,000 rows. It is the name and salaries of every single city of Chicago employee. So while this data is useful, the data can be quite large and it can be quite small, but it's useful at the end of the day. And that's the main part of it. And an open data portal serves a number of different ends. One, it allows you to download information, it allows you to see what's there, and also allows you to view and look at different charts and information so you can understand patterns and trends. But at the end of the day, it's a flexible tool that you can use. It's something that you can use for a lot of different purposes. And as I mentioned, I want to spend some time talking about those different use cases and how this information might be able to be used for anywhere from a class project to doing serious research, or how journalists have even been able to use this within their work as well. So the City of Chicago has released even more open data. This is an example of red light camera violations. This is something that came up that was very newsworthy in the City of Chicago in terms of how many red light tickets are being issued on a day-to-day basis. And so you can go to a data portal to look at red light camera violations, speed camera violations, the list of problematic landlords who constantly have issues and maybe you something want to avoid, to public chauffeurs of people who are allowed to drive taxi cabs around or limousines around. This is the type of information. And as what you see here, this is a visual display of the information that's on the data portal. This, looking at red light camera violations, you see the ebbs and flows, you see the spikes, you see dips. If you would scroll down on this webpage, you could take a look at this by geography. So this is something that we would call a human readable format. This is something that would be designed that people could go to at a variety of different technical skill levels where you can share and visualize information with everybody else. But it needs to go beyond that. Open data is more than just being a dashboard. It needs to allow people to be able to work with data, to manipulate that data. And I don't mean the manipulation in the way that you can doctor it. I mean manipulation that you want to analyze it with however the way that you want to analyze it by. Not just to be constricted by a graph or a picture that you see on the screen. But as we have more programmers, if we have more data scientists, as we have more whip-smart students out there, being able to download and look at information and analyze it from a variety of different perspectives is helpful for the entire community. And that's the premise around an open data portal. Now, as I mentioned, the thing about the portal is being flexible. And so when we take a look at an open data portal, what's really a key to that is collaboration. That the City of Chicago data portal is meant to help other agencies, that other folks, other city departments are able to use that information, that businesses are able to use this information. So they can pull that information and start a new service. Actually, just the other day, I didn't throw this to a slide, but just the other day, there's a new online startup that just opened up in Chicago. They started in New York City, and Chicago is their second city, but allows realtors to look at properties and what's happening around those properties. So you can take a look at neighboring crime. You can take a look at complaints that are happening around. So when realtors are taking a look at a property, trying to sell a home, they can also display other information around that property so people can understand what they might be investing in or trying to buy. And they explicitly called out the use of open data because they bring in open data to be able to display what's happening around homes that people want to buy. And so open data can also serve business needs as well. Quite clearly, researchers are able to use this information, pulling that in. I've seen one of the greatest things when I served as chief data officers, every once in a while I'd read an academic article that would be very interesting. And when reading about the article that would pertain to Chicago, you would read the description of what they would do. And a lot of times you'd see researchers use the city's open data portal. They would incorporate that into their research, and then that research would then be published. Community members and nonprofits also need to be able to leverage the data portal so they can advocate for what they want to argue for, and they can understand where there might be problems and opportunities throughout the city. And then likewise, other cities and jurisdictions can leverage things like an open data portal to be able to understand what's happening at their borders. So one of the things that's great about an open data portal I want to talk to you about, it's the sense of community that happens around it. This is a group called Shy Hack Night. It was actually originally called Open Gov Hack Night. And this is a video clip. I'm not sure how clear it is on your side because it's video over Zoom. It's always a bit tough. But this is their 1-year anniversary. This is a time, this is up in 1871, which is a startup incubator and accelerator in Merchandise Mart. This is their 1-year birthday where, and I'm in there in the back, but you had about 20 to 30 people every single Tuesday crammed into a pretty small room. And this room got really hot just because of the number of people that got loaded up in there. These people came together because they wanted to talk about open data. They wanted to see how can they use information and data to help improve their community. Folks that come to these sort of meetings are students, they're professional programmers, they're professional data analysts, and there's a lot of folks who are just interested in their own civic community. But this was a way to bring people together to talk about how to use open data. And they would create things using the open data portal. Well, I should actually first say that the open data provides a means to create an ecosystem around data. And so that includes those stakeholders and initiatives that brought people into that room. So it goes beyond just talking about transparency, making data publicly available. It's about creating that ecosystem around data and to be able to create things. This is what that exact same group looks like now for their 5th birthday. So instead of that small room where 20 or 30 people crammed themselves into, they moved locations, also in Merchandise Mart at Braintree headquarters. And here you have between 50 to 150 people showing up every single Tuesday, wondering how they can use technology and data to be able to improve their community. And again, as I mentioned before, they create things. This is a website that is based on open data. And this is a very seasonally appropriate aspect. We're coming up on flu shots. So go get your flu shots if you haven't already gotten your flu shots. And especially in the COVID world, this is particularly important to avoid having both the flu and COVID at the same time, which would absolutely stress the medical system. But ChicagoFluShots.org was actually created, it was a website first created by a programmer who worked for the University of Chicago. Wasn't an academic research, it was somebody who works in the IT department within the University of Chicago, who took open data about where you can go find flu shots, which was simply just a spreadsheet, where you can go download this information, and turned it into a helpful website where people can go and navigate trying to find a flu shot. So this was a volunteer who came along, took a look at data and says, you know what, I can make this into a friendly website. But what was very interesting about this project, not only did this person make a website, but also open sourced the code. And what I mean by open sourcing the code is by taking that code and putting it online so other people can also view and download that code. So other programmers, other web developers can take and download that information. And also importantly, putting a license or giving permission for others to be able to use it however that they want to use it. Because of this, Boston, Philadelphia, and San Francisco also launched their own flu shot finder website using that exact same code base. So not only did this project first share information about where you could go find a flu shot, but also shared the underlying code beneath it so other people could adopt and have the similar websites. And that saves time and that creates efficiency by sharing that information. So we use this data, and we can use this data in a lot of different ways. I mentioned that one website, but I also want to talk about another different way that this information can be used. This is a data set. What you see here is actually a list of all food inspections that are conducted by the city of Chicago. This data goes back to 2010, January 1st, 2010. So if you have a favorite restaurant that you really like, you can actually go and see what their most recent food inspection. You can actually go look at all the food inspections that your favorite restaurant has like. You may not want to. You may just not want to break that imagination of a perfectly clean restaurant. But if you do want to, that information is there. And you can take a look at what happened. You can take a look at restaurants that have a completely clean bill of health, and you can take a look at restaurants that had issues or problems started to arise. So you can actually use this information to do something else. You can use it to create predictions. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to advance. You can use this information to create predictions. Now this data was all online, like I said before, but there's a lot of other information that's also online. And by being able to combine this information, you'll be able to understand what's happening. So let me give you an example. This is a food inspector. This is actually a City of Chicago food inspector. Her name is Anita. She's actually one of the better food inspectors at the City of Chicago. I'll explain that here in a second. But this is Anita in part. This is just a small clip on loop where she's conducting a food inspection. So look at what she's doing. She's checking vents. She has a flashlight. She's using thermometers to make sure that things are at the appropriate temperature, hot when they need to be hot, cold when they need to be cold. She's checking dates when she's back there in the refrigerator. She's actually checking dates on shellfish, because when things get packed up, you need to write the date that it got packed up, because you can't leave that shellfish in the freezer for that long. So it's a very involved process. Look at it. This is really an inspection. So the question here is, you have somebody like Anita who has to go to a lot of different locations across the entire city of Chicago. Now, the city of Chicago is 250 square miles. That's the size of the city of Chicago. That's about 600 square kilometers for those who speak of more scientific metrics. So when we take a look across the entire city of Chicago, where does Anita need to go? Where are the more dangerous restaurants or the riskier restaurants that are more likely to have critical violations that could cause issues? So it's a bit of a needle in a haystack. And so we take a look across the city of Chicago, where might be the higher risk locations so the city of Chicago can operate more efficiently. So we used open data. We built, I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of it, we can talk about it more, but we built a website ingesting data from the open data portal, bringing that information together to allow the Department of Public Health to prioritize which inspections need to be done first. So by taking a look at food inspection data online, combining that with data such as weather, combining that with data such as complaints about restaurants, combining that data with inspectors themselves, we could see the differences, and we could see which restaurant was more effective, and we could actually see which employee was more effective. In this case, Anita was far more likely to find violations compared to her peers while controlling for a bunch of other information. And as a result, while this is backed by open data, our food inspection team would see this website. This website would contain 15,000 restaurants that are contained within the city of Chicago, and give risk orders, give magnitudes of risk of the chance of finding critical violations with each one of those restaurants. So the city could then take their 36 food inspectors, who again have to inspect 15,000 restaurants, take those 36 food inspectors and allocate them to the restaurants that were most at risk. And what's interesting about this, going back to alluding to that flu shot website that we talked about earlier, this code itself is actually open source. You can go to this website, github.com/Chicago, and you can find this project called Food Inspection Evaluation. This contains the underlying code that drives that model. Because the data is public, because that data can be seen by anybody else, we also make the code public as well so people can understand the underlying logic and the underlying algorithms that are driving that prediction program. Likewise, people can also submit improvements to that code. So just by first starting with open data and talking about sharing data publicly, we can also talk about how we can share other things publicly as well, and that we can work together as a community through collaboration to try to improve the processes within cities like Chicago. I want to talk about one other project as well. I want to talk about beaches. Now, this is not seasonally appropriate like the Flu Shots website is, but this is certainly something that is very important for Chicagoans. Now, as you probably all know, because you're right down the street, if you're on the campus, you're right down the street from beaches. The city of Chicago has 15 miles of beaches, and I think we have about 30 beaches across those 15 miles. We have hundreds of thousands of visitors to those beaches every single day. And of course, as you know, we have beach season, which is capped by a few months. And so being able to visit one of those beaches is really important. But something that happens within those beaches is elevated E. coli levels. And I'm not sure if you've ever seen that before. If you go to a beach and you see a yellow flag stuck into the sand. And what that is a warning that E. coli levels are likely to be high that day. Now, E. coli is a natural phenomenon that's going to occur in beaches. And in the case for Chicago's beaches, we don't have a particular point of pollution. We have a lot of things that are happening. We have animals that go into the water. We have birds that fly over the water. We have a variety of runoff. It's a lake. It's a giant lake. So we have runoff from a variety of different cities that sit around there. So E. coli is a natural occurring phenomenon. And at times, the E. coli levels for a particular beach might be higher than what is that is recommended to be taken in during the course of the day. However, this is a bit of a problem. To determine whether or not there's E. coli in the water, you have to do biological sampling. And to be able to do that, you have to collect a water sample in the morning. And it takes about 12 hours to understand whether or not there's E. coli in the water for that given sample. Well, that doesn't make sense. If I take a sample at 6 o'clock in the morning, I don't actually know if there's E. coli until 6 o'clock at night. So you have to rely on a statistical model, and you have to rely on a statistical model to estimate whether or not we think there's high levels of E. coli in the water for that given day. The problem is that this original statistical model that was developed by the United States Geological Survey, the USGS, who developed this statistical model, wasn't very good. Now, these are data science terms I'm throwing out in front of you. You see some terms out there such as accuracy and specificity and precision. So accuracy in general is talking about, am I guessing it right? Am I guessing whether or not there's actually E. coli in the water that day? And the accuracy is pretty good, but the problem is that sensitivity number. That sensitivity bar is about 5%. And this is also something called the true positive rate. And the true positive rate is, hey, how many times do I actually guess correctly there's going to be E. coli levels? And that only happens around 5% of the time. Now, while E. coli is a natural phenomenon, it doesn't happen that often. And basically what's happening is the old statistical model back in 2016 would just simply usually say there's no E. coli in the water today, because most of the time there is no E. coli in the water that day. However, there are days where there is E. coli in the water, at least high levels of E. coli. And the model was not very good in determining those days. And to this point, it only determined that correctly about 5% of the time. Now, it might be one thing to say, hey, our accuracy is 93%, we're right 93% of the time. That sounds like a really good number, but the really important number is when there's actual levels of E. coli, am I guessing that right, is quite low. But this is a difficult problem. This is a difficult problem. And so we've created a statistical model that used some new statistical methodologies, that use some advancements in data science to be able to increase those numbers. 175% increase from 4% to 11%. And also being able to grow precision as well. But that sensitivity number, that am I guessing it right when there's actually high levels of E. coli, went up from 4% to 11%. Still a pretty low number, but a quite dramatic gain. But what was very interesting about this project was this statistical model was actually developed by those individuals you saw earlier at Shy Hack Night. They leveraged the open data portal to bring that information in, to be able to bring that in, to be able to create this new statistical model. They used their knowledge and their techniques to be able to understand how can we help this problem. And they did that in collaboration with the city of Chicago. My team worked closely with them to understand how can we do a better job at this. But we didn't have enough time to actually develop that model. So we asked the community to help out. And indeed, and we saw the results that you see here today, where you saw the 175% increase in that sensitivity metric. And this paper got, and this work actually got turned into an academic article. There's this article predicting E. coli concentrations using limited qPCR deployments at Chicago beaches. This is a really fancy way that we figured out how to better predict that using some technology and some data science at a higher level. Now, my name is listed in the authors there. I'll just point that out. My name is listed here, but what's quite interesting, everybody else listed on the list of authors here were community volunteers. These are people who donated their time. A couple of these were students at DePaul University who actually used this as part of a class project to be able to help visualize some of this information and help to be able to do some of the statistics. So this truly was a community project that had real applicable value to the city of Chicago, being able to just better understand when the beaches are going to be clean to be able to get into that water. Turned it also into academic research that was peer reviewed and published and is used by the city today. And I also had one other great story about this as well. This is the team after we finished the project and we did a presentation. So this is some of the co-authors. And there's other people who helped on the project that asked not to be co-authors or just didn't have time to be able to contribute to that work. But I want to point out the gentleman on the left. The gentleman on the left, I'm on the far right-hand side, sans beard. On the left-hand side is Nick Lucius. Nick Lucius was one of the contributors to the project. He joined the project as a volunteer. Nick Lucius today is now the Chief Data Officer for the City of Chicago. As he worked on this project, we hired him as well. He was a very good data scientist and had strong qualities and attributes. And then from there, he's now the Chief Data Officer who leads these type of programs today for the Lightfoot administration. So this is another great story about how open data talked about open collaboration, and that collaboration helped bring people in, qualified, really good, talented individuals, and bring them into government, helping work for government. This was Nick's actually first data scientist job. He was a lawyer, a government lawyer for years, and he also had some technical skill as a background, but came in as a data scientist. And so this was also an opportunity for us to identify people to bring in and being very talented individuals who are still making a contribution to the city of Chicago today. So again, this was a very high level presentation. Want to touch on a number of different aspects, didn't dig into a lot of details on each one of those. But hopefully you can spend the remainder of the time here, or however much time you'd like, to hit on any questions or to dive into anything deeper than what I was able to get into today. So I'll pause there for now and I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you so much, Tom. That was really interesting. I had a long time ago worked on a Chicago Beach project, and that was back when it was E. coli testing, although there was a lot of rumblings then about predictive modeling. So it's really interesting to think about people's behavior and how they might respond to a warning about E. coli, even though it's not accurate at the time that they're looking at it, right? So it'd be really interesting to compare how that affects behavior between the two types of testing, and how much people even knew about it at the time. So let me start with some of the questions from the chat. I see there's one from Luke Joyner, and it's a little bit of a long question. Luke, do you want to unmute and ask this yourself? Luke is one of our instructors here at the university in urban design, urban planning. I can read it otherwise, Luke. Oh, I don't even know if he's still here, so let me ask this question. Yeah. I'm curious how the E. coli levels were communicated this summer when the beaches were technically closed, but effectively open before 11 and after 7. As someone who lives in Rogers Park, just a few blocks from the beach, I swam every single morning and evening this summer. heck, even yesterday, and the flag was always red, so it gave no information of this sort. Was there a conversation around this? The data can be fantastic, but it also matters whether people actually understand it. So.
Yeah, so I don't know how the implementation was actually this past summer. Wasn't with the city and didn't know how they handled this very unique situation. What's interesting though, that flag was red, and red flag doesn't usually indicate anything about water quality in E. coli. Sabina, and you probably knows quite well, E. coli is usually only an indicator, only really an issue for those who are immunocompromised or have other issues. But otherwise, it's a warning. It's not something that you have to actively involve. They don't close beaches because of E. coli. The red flagger is usually there for riptides to prohibit swimming because of dangerous swimming conditions. So it's quite possible, given from what I understand this past summer, that those flags were specifically around riptides and the water conditions for swimming as opposed to water quality. I don't know if testing, and this is going to be a big thing, I don't know if testing continued throughout the course of the summer, since if they're technically closed, why do you need to test the water? But by not testing the water, you would harm the statistical model because there's a lot of information that could be collected during that point in time. So hopefully they still did for that ongoing cataloging to understand what that water quality is. But I don't know actually how they handled the logistics of raising warnings or prohibitions given the circumstances this past summer.
And I would think certainly understanding how, if at all, water quality changed during the massive behavior change that we've had over the summer would be very valuable information. So hopefully they were testing that, and the data is there. Other questions that we can take for Tom? I know my colleague, I was just going to call on you, Emily. Emily Talon is a professor of urbanism here at the University of Chicago.
You okay?
Yes.
Am I on?
You're on, Emily. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. It seems like my internet is doing weird things. But I had a question about accessing data from, I think, maybe the Public Works Department or the engineers at the city, because I'm always looking for things like the building footprints, the actual building locations. It used to be a GIS layer, and now I don't think it's up to date. Also things like street width, sidewalk width. I know that the engineering folks, the city, have all this kind of data, but I don't think it's in the portal. And I wondered if there was a way to kind of get at people in the city bureaucracy and kind of agitate for certain layers that I know that they have.
Certainly. So some of that goes into some logistics. So building footprint data is on the portal. It is lagged. The city, because of its administrative processes, don't always know when buildings have been demolished. It's actually a very manual process that people have to go through and figure out, is this building still around or not? So for instance, eliminating some of those building footprints can get dated. There's a lot of footprints there that really aren't there anymore because the building had been demolished before. And new buildings, those footprints should be updated. But the GIS, it is a very large file, and so the GIS team doesn't always do that. It's something that they come around to and update in batches. But I think as about as frequently as that particular file, and again, have fondness for that data set and aware of how that process works. About as much as that GIS team updates it in that digital format, it does get updated on the portal, but it takes time to update that file. Street widths and things like that, there's a real good point there on that. And that's a great example of a data set that would be valuable on the data portal. So a couple of ways, there's a couple of ways of doing it. One is reaching out to the open data team at dataportal@cityofchicago.org. That's a team who manages it. They take data requests in. There's always a triaging of what do we need to work on today versus what are data sets that are maybe lower priority. And the team is paying attention to what are people asking for, because ultimately that's what we're trying to service is trying to get data sets out there that are going to be used and is useful for the public. The other aspect of that is teaming up with others. And so groups like Shy Hack Night, what's very interesting, it's very It's very classical in a lot of different ways. It's a special interest group, and it's a special interest group of using data and technology to improve the community. Just like we've had interest groups and advocacy organizations, Shy Hack Night does a good job. And so there can be peers within there who also want the same information. There's a number of transportation enthusiasts who join groups like that, who ask the city for information like that. And there could be coordination that can happen there to try to make those contacts, to sway the people to try to get information onto the data portal. I would often go to those meetings, and I know Nick Lucius attends those meetings as much as he can, to understand, again, what are those needs, what are people wanting, and so the data portal can be responsive to that. It takes work to get things on the data portal, so there's some triaging if we're going to work that it takes, but sometimes it's just trying to get to those folks who, like the chief data officer or other members of the data team, to say, this is really important and there's some good cases here. Can we get that onto the data portal? And the team will work on that. But I will say too, there is logistical challenges. Sometimes you think that the data is nicely well centralized in storage and something that you can get data frequently refreshed. There's a number of stories where I've worked with that, and you look at where a data source is and you just wonder why is it organized in that fashion? Because it makes it very hard to put it on something like an open data portal. So there could also just be some very pragmatic issues why that's been hard to get onto the data portal. But I don't know, I can't comment specifically on that one.
Okay, well, thanks. It gives me hope, and I know what I need to do to agitate. Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess I have a follow-up question to that in terms of how data is collected at the city. Is it a data team that goes to the departments and says, hey, we want building data, I want this, or is it within the department that someone is collecting data and being cognizant of the format that would make the most sense to put it on the data portal?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the data that the city has, for better or worse, is driven by administrative processes. There's a law that was passed that says that the city has to collect information, or we implement systems to collect information because we need to manage the workflow of people or making sure that checks are being paid. So the premise of these data systems is administrative in nature, to do something, that the city has to do something. And that's good because there's a lot of things that the city does, which means there's a lot of data from that. But then there's data that we don't have just because the city lacks authority or a mandate to do something, where the state might be doing something or a county might be collecting information that the city doesn't have access to. When it comes to the creation of those systems, again, it starts with what are we needing to do operationally? Do we need to keep track of inspections, and so we need to build a system? Those systems get designed and are implemented to meet the business needs. So the IT department works with individual businesses to stand those up. The technology and the data is housed within the technology departments. But again, it's housed to work for each individual agency and department. But at the same time, the data team, while they work with agencies and departments to help them work with that data, they can also think about how that data can be used in other facets and other ways that may go beyond that original administrative need. Give you an example. The city of Chicago is one of two cities, and the city of Chicago was the first city to collect fairly detailed rideshare trip data and rideshare data in general, the vehicles, the drivers, the trips, nothing about the passenger. And the reason why that information was collected is because needed to make sure that the rideshare companies were adhering to the law that was passed to allow them to organize. So for instance, needed to know the type of vehicles because there's limitations on the age of vehicles, or if the vehicle is old, it has to go through inspection so often. Likewise, if God forbid something happens in a rideshare trip, we need to know information about that vehicle in case we need to find that vehicle somewhere else. Likewise with the drivers, there's a lot of prohibitions on the drivers themselves in terms of who can be a driver or not. So needed to collect that information. And for the trips themselves, needed to understand trip information to make sure that the rideshare companies are paying their share of tax that was required through that ordinance. So airport trips, there's a $5 tax on it, if I recall correctly, trips from McCormick Center. So we needed this information to serve administrative needs, to enforce the law. But that data is also extremely valuable for urban planners, for departments of transportation, for planning purposes, to understand how the shape of the city is changing. So that's a really good example of a data system and data collection being implemented for administrative purposes, but also understanding how we can use that information and data for different ends, for different agencies and different departments.
Great. So now, as what usually happens, we have a whole bunch of questions for you. So let me ask you a couple that came from our undergraduate students, from Brandon. Hi, Tom. I wanted to ask how individual residents of communities are made aware of Chicago's open data portal. I wonder how local community members would be able to know where to find the website and how to navigate these useful data sets if they aren't connected to academic or research spheres. In other words, what are the ways in which the portal is being popularized among the everyday Chicagoan?
Brandon, really good question. It starts with conversations like these, and it starts to reaching out to NGOs, nonprofits, researchers, to make people aware of resources that are available to them. The data portal, the last numbers that I recall are about 1 million visits a year, about 250,000 visitors, unique visitors throughout the course of the year. And this is globally. We got people from all over who access this. But it begins with conversations. It begins press releases, things like that early on. But it's those conversations to make people aware, this is for you. It's for how you want to use it. Here are some examples about how this can be used. And here's the service that the city can provide if you have questions. So you have a point of contact to reach out. But it's conversations like these where this needs to start.
Great. So we have a question from Nico, who's a data scientist here at the university in the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation. Maybe you know him, but his question is, are there efforts to better standardize data sets across various cities? Great question.
So many discussions on it. And I was probably one of the folks that was probably most anti-standards. I wouldn't say anti-standards. I was hesitant on the use of the standards. And I think the tension comes down to this. And I work for a consulting firm where I every single day just wish this data was standardized across governments, because we want to take a look at national views and regional views. But from my city perspective, there's tension sometimes. And first and foremost, data portals and data need to be able to serve the residents. And there's a lot of local issues that people ask about. For instance, with salaries and overtime in Chicago, it's a sensitive topic. And so there is fields and data that we were communicating because we know locally we need to publish this information, because those were data that were very helpful within the local conversation and context. However, in the greater context, those fields and data may not be interesting as a data standard across different cities. And so I think things start to break down when you start trying to service national audiences and also trying to service local audiences. And in my perspective, I would try to focus more on the local perspective. And sometimes that would mean deviating from standard. That being said, this is a conversation that comes up a lot. One of the things I did at the State of Chicago was found something called the Civic Analytics Network, based out of Harvard University, which was a network of chief data officers and chief analytic officers. We talked every month. We met twice a year in Cambridge, where we talked through issues like this, trying to look for collaboration, being able to introduce standards. So this is a conversation that is actively happening. It's not a blanket no, and there are data standards out there from things like salary data. There's actually a website, I think, called data.dictionary that talks about civic data standards like this. There's a new data standard around transportation data. So when you take a look at rideshare data, you take a look at cab trip data, it's all being published in the same format. So it's a very active conversation, but it can be a contentious one.
So I'm going to try to combine a question from Chris and Kriti here. So apologies if it's not very eloquent, but Kriti's question is, given the privacy concerns on data access, was there any pushback from the public or public consultation? And related to that is Chris's question of, what were the conversations, data goes on the portal, what's left off of the portal, and basically who's represented by the data that's available in the portal?
That's a really good question. I'll work backwards a little bit. So sometimes what goes onto the data portal, we have another process called FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests. And so the public can request information. Largely that includes everything, but sometimes we have to make determinations of some data cannot be always divulged to others. And so we look at FOIA guidelines as one of the guardrails of what can go onto the portal versus what cannot go onto a portal. But when we talk about publishing information every single day and it being refreshed every single day, there's even extra scrutiny because you can FOIA more information than what's necessarily involved on the portal. And that includes things that we might need to be concerned about privacy, making sure that people can't back out individual relationships. So those conversations happen a lot internally. They happen a lot with legal teams, but this is where groups such as Shy Hack Night, ACLU, EFF have had conversations with each one of those groups at various points in time to just sometimes just try to gut check. Some of these decisions about what ends up on a portal versus not in a portal isn't because of a law, and it isn't because of well-known practices. This is all new, so it's a lot of times have to go to a gut check. If we publish this, this is one of the guiding principles. If we publish this, are we going to freak people out? Are you, if you're an individual resident and you come to the portal and you see information is being published and you take a step back, like, I can't believe this is being published online. That's one of those guardrails that we need to be cautious of. So we try to reach out to applicable NGOs, nonprofits, advocacy groups to gut check. I'll give you one example. I talked about publishing rideshare data on the data portal. Of course, we don't publish individual location. That gets aggregated up to zip codes or community area. It's actually a differential privacy rule. It depends on how many trips there are and the chance of being able to back out something. But that took about 6 to 8 months of conversations. We had the data ready. The data was ready to be published, but we had to have a lot of conversations with folks to say, at what granularity, if we publish this, would this disturb people? Versus the analytical usefulness of publishing very granular data. And trying to balance that just really has to involve conversations with folks and making sure that we're not overstepping the expectations of individuals.
Great. Well, we have a couple of questions from Evan Carver, who's one of our faculty here in urban studies. But let me start with one of them. He talks about how it's common to compare data across the city. So do you, or does the city or the portal prefer a certain unit of measurement? So community areas use zip code, aldermanic ward for analysis. From your perspective, is there one that's preferred, or are there advantages of disadvantages of one over the other?
Yeah, so many, and we're going to be coming up on census time, so we're all probably, I imagine the teams are going to be looking at the boundaries of census units and how they line up to community areas and how they line up to various different geographies that get used, zip code, and every single one's controversial, right? Zip code is an administrative unit. It's a way for the postal office to divvy up their work. Census blocks and census tracts make a lot of sense, but sometimes they don't make practical sense in terms of how we recognize the city. Community area, I think at the very least, is that common denominator of looking at across the city. It's been very static for well over 100 years now. It's how we recognize ourselves in a lot of different ways, and Chicagoans communicate a lot of ways of where they're from by just communicating their community area. So that's probably the most common denominator, and it's also where we get the most frequently requested. I see in here is mentioning about ACS and census data. Sometimes what the team is doing is just pulling together publicly available information, but re-aggregating it so people can look at lifespans or number of births by different community areas, just because that's how people want to consume that information. Though when we can, we try to get into those smaller geographies, again, respecting privacy if that's going to be an issue, so people can cut up that data in a lot of different ways.
Great, thank you. So we have another question from one of our undergraduate students, Javi, practical question. To get in touch with the dataset owners, it looks like there's a contact dataset owner link. Is there another way to communicate with specific GIS teams to talk about the data?
I'll go through the contact owner. A lot of that's going to go through data portal at cityofchicago.org, and then that gets distributed out to a few different folks, and they are in a good position to connect you with others. While there's data owners and this data is being maintained elsewhere, through the act of publishing this data, the data team needs to understand the data and the information behind it. So some of the questions they can answer because they might have had the same questions themselves. It's often the case that the data portal team is asking the same questions that a lot of people eventually ask down the road. And if not, they know the right points of contact to run down those questions. It is a balancing act. Every one of these data owners, they have a day-to-day job. They're trying to do their job, and so the data portal team can help just help more quickly get to those questions and be able to get those questions and relay those answers back, and to make sure everybody's able to do their day-to-day job, but also being able to help the broader community answer questions that might come up.
Great. Well, maybe I can take the opportunity to ask one from my list of about 10 questions here for you, but I'm curious about the qualitative dimension to this, right? So take the restaurants at risks, for example, right? Is there's differences obviously that might result from employee behavior or different training or equipment or things that may not show up in the data. And that's just one example, but I'm curious about if the city or the portal itself sort of gives some advice about how to use the data. If you tell a data story from this and maybe you're missing some qualitative dimensions to it, right? Or maybe you're not understanding cultural influences that make things look a certain way. So I'm curious if there's any conversation about that with the use of the data.
You try to describe the data and the metadata as best as you can. To your point, there's administrative processes underneath each one of these data sets. There's a reason why the data is being generated. There's a reason why maybe something got reported in one area but didn't get reported somewhere else. For instance, we know that people call 311 non-emergency services at different rates across the city. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what that is, but we know that there's different levels of engagement. And it's actually quite interesting. We've done some statistical analysis. If you just looking along income levels, if you look at lower quartiles of income and upper quartiles of income in those neighborhoods, they report to 311 about the same frequency. So there seems to be maybe potentially community disengagement happening on both extremes of income, and that's just looking at one dimension, right? That's not a complete analysis. So we tried to describe what the data is, what those fields are representing, but it's always going to be incomplete. That's where I think communication is just really important, to have those communications with individuals. I do see a lot of bad analysis that comes from the data portal, and you try to jump in, you have those conversations. I think, again, this is where other communities and researchers play a role in jumping in. But as a data portal where you're both servicing transparency needs and also trying to enable others to do information with it, the transparency aspect kind of forces information to go public, to make sure that at least you're communicating that. And you do have to just rely on others. But there is a principle for the data portal, and actually a principle that I try to practice with data in general. It's trying not to plan around the lowest common denominator of how bad this data could be used, because that conversation, I think, would always lead to not sharing information. I think there's always scenarios where you can see how data can be used quite poorly. You try to do your best to communicate that, but at the end of the day, it is necessary to share that information, to share that data, so other people can analyze and look at what's happening within government.
Great. So let's see I think we have time for maybe 2 more quick questions, and there's 2 more in the chat. From one of our undergraduate students, Daphne, do you have any connections with the Chicago Health Atlas? Do you use similar health indicators or data sets?
Absolutely. Health Atlas was a project that spun out of the Department of Public Health, long collaborators with them. It's now ran by the City Tech Collaborative. And so that's a great example of publishing data in a human readable way, but also can be downloaded to look at that information. A lot of the data sets for the Health Atlas didn't make quite sense for the data portal, or at least it needed to be visualized a bit more cleanly in a lot of different ways. And so those projects were in tandem with each other. Worked a lot with that team to make sure that we're coordinating. Is there stuff that can go on the data portal that can then be fed over to the Health Atlas, or how do we balance those platforms? Absolutely.
All right, well, we have some final questions from Chris. Does all the data on the portal come from the city, or are there privately sourced data sets integrated with appropriate quality controls?
There was some stuff that didn't come from the city, but they came from other public entities where maybe we filtered it down just to look in Chicago, or it came from Cook County and we filtered it down just to look at the city of Chicago. 99% of it though is coming from city databases because that's information that we're providing novel access to. Some other public data sources, but no private data sources got republished into the portal.
Okay, and then for researchers who are considering a data set in the portal, I've noticed this too, some of the data sets, the data ends in like 2010 or 2011. Is there an indication given when more data might come online, or is that something you have to get by FOIA request?
I'd reach out to them. Sometimes those data end because a system might have just died out. There is a principle within the data portal team of don't remove data. So if it's old data, and it was there, to keep it there so it could be used for backward-looking analysis. Whenever possible, the data is automatically updated. So if it died out, it's because perhaps the system died out. The team does try to use a deprecated marker so you know when the data set it's there, but it's deprecated and it's not going to be updated. So I just reach out to the data portal team and ask, hey, do you know if there's an update coming along the lines of this, or is this the end of the data set? Sometimes there's an old data set and then there's a new data set, and we keep the old data set there for archival purposes, for transparency purposes, but the data set might have picked up somewhere else and is being continued somewhere else. Usually there's pointers, but it's possible that just got missed in the documentation. So I'd reach out because they might be able to provide some context, or they tell you like, oh no, that one's old, move over to the new data set and the refresh data. And then it also serves as an indicator for them of helping improve documentation. It's just very easy to miss that.
Great. Maybe I can just end with one final question since that's all that's here, but I don't know if anyone has watched this new Netflix documentary on the social dilemma and about sort of the ethical concerns and social responsibility of data scientists and technology industry. I don't know if you can comment on what you think potentially are either the limitations or the concerns about using data to influence city planning or city policy, if any.
I think there's still a tremendous amount of promise there. Data around planning, I think we're not even close scratching the surface. We need to be able to bring in more information to understand what that future looks like. So I don't think we've quite got to scratch the surface of that. And in part, some of the data systems aren't collecting necessary information to really be able to make use of information for city planning purposes. We were talking about building footprints earlier. It takes a long time to get that stuff updated. And that's some of your most foundational sort of data that you need. So I don't think we've even gotten to the point of really being able to do that well.
Great. Well, thank you, Tom. This was extremely illuminating and enlightening, and I think we could talk to you for hours, but in the interest of your time, we greatly appreciate you joining us. I'm going to turn it back to Chris to wrap up here, but thank you.
Thanks so much again, Tom, and thank you, Sabina, for facilitating our conversation. Thanks also for everyone who contributed questions. If you have follow-up inquiries, if you are interested in exploring some of the topics that Tom raised, or some of the kinds of data that you find on the data portal or elsewhere in more detail, this is an ongoing series that we are just launching with the goal of supporting people who are looking to do better and deeper research into the city of Chicago. We do have 2 more of these sessions already on the books. One of them will be at the end of October with our friends from the Media Burn Archive, which is a really great archive of documentary footage that traces the history of the city of Chicago. That'll be on Wednesday, the 28th of October. And then Nico Marcio, who was here, maybe still is, he asked one of our early questions about standardization. Nico is going to do a piece on the 18th of November, also a Wednesday, where he takes us on kind of a backwards look from a finished analytic visualization and goes all the way back to the beginning, sort of how do we get to this fully realized, visualized analysis, going back to raw data, what decisions get made along the way. But again, an ongoing series, so please let us know. I should also mention, another event that we're going to be a part of tomorrow evening. For those of you who are just Chicagophiles, tomorrow night we're co-sponsoring with the folks from the Film Studies program and the Cinema and Media Studies department a program that will screen last year's senior level documentary films about the city of Chicago. So if you want to learn more about chicken raising in the West Side, or about women's rugby teams, or the legacy of the 1919 race riots, or how hard it has been for family-owned restaurants to stay open in the midst of the COVID pandemic, join us tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Details about these and all sorts of other programs are available on the Chicago Studies website, and also in our weekly newsletter, which comes out every week on Monday, and which you can subscribe to either by signing up for an event like this one, or by visiting the Chicago Studies website, chicagostudies.uchicago.edu. Again, special thanks to those who helped to put today together. Shannon Morrissey is our graduate assistant who provided a lot of support. Dr. Schenk for facilitating, all of those who contributed questions, and especially to Tom Schenk. Thank you all. The recording of this session will be made available on the Chicago Studies website a little bit later today. Appreciate you. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.